Well, it's been 3 weeks that I did the introduction on Amos, so I'm going to do a little overlap and introduction again. So some of it you'll hear. I mean, there's some people that may be joining us, so I'm going to try not to be too redundant, but I really do think it's important for us to be able to keep the continuity of the introduction with the message. And I'm not going to go through chapter 1 in every one of the nation, where they go through, Amos goes through every nation and gives the woes and the things to them. We'll discuss that this evening. But I want to come back and look at some of the important aspects of him. Let's remember, the minor prophets again. It's just because it's a little book. It's not because it's a little message. Amos is probably the most powerful one. It's the most stern book. He has very little room for compassion towards those who are in transgression. He shows a lot of compassion towards those of the poor, those who are the victims of this society, of what's going on. He is a man who, in many ways, would be very unsuited to do this job by societal standards because he's not a prophet. His name alone is burden bearer, and it was a burden that he had to bear. One of the interesting things is the timeline when we look at when was he doing this, when he brought his prophecies, is around 755, or what they say, the 8th century BC. And it's very important, again, to look at the historical, what's going on in the world, as I say, because it helps to understand why that message is so important and why the nation is in the condition they're in. Let's kind of recall that, because when we look at this, we remember that the nation of Israel, as it used to be called when it was one, was, God's people, Israel. We hear that. Once Solomon died, God had said he was going to split the kingdom apart, and he did. Jeroboam went to the north, and he took the 10 northern tribes. Rehoboam, his son, ruled in the south, was a very hard man, which set forward. Now, Jeroboam the first, he did not want the people going south. He was jealous. He did not want people to go down and worship where they should be worshiping. Just because God split the kingdom did not mean that he wanted two different religious people. He had one covenant, and he had one way to please him. And yes, he said he had split it, and it split, but let's not forget, their choice of religious worship was their own. And Jeroboam the first is the one. And I keep saying first because there's a Jeroboam the second that we're dealing with during this timeline. But he set up the golden calf. He set it up in the very far north in Dan, and then he set it up in Bethel. And in Bethel was the heart of kind of their spiritual world. It would be the Vatican, a place where all the false gods, the false priests were gathered there. But he made it a religion of convenience. He made it a religion where they didn't have to travel. He also changed the main month of worship away from the one that God had picked. Everything about this, and this does set forward, if we think about it, these false religions in why they took the path they take. Almost all the kings of the north, they ruled about 3 years. They were very bad. The average ruling is around 3 years. Now, also recall a guy named Ahab and Jezebel. Some of the very evil kings, these are just before what we have here. Now, God has punished them. Now, what I'm saying is God up to this point has already inflicted some attention getters to wake them up. And they didn't listen. And he's going to remind them of this. He's going to say this. And and then it's like God gave a reprieve. There was this compassion in God where he allowed the enemies to subside, not to be as threatening. And now we come into the prophet Jonah. This is what we call falling into pre-Assyrian, Assyrian rise. So the Assyrians are sitting over there in Nineveh. And when Jonah went, remember, they were being judged, and God said, you better straighten up, I'm going to destroy you, and judgment's coming. And they straightened up. This is that lull. This is that time where God's like, okay, I'm going to leave the Assyrians alone, and there's some peace there. So everybody's kind of in check. Everything's kind of nice. There's some rumblings out there, but nothing real serious. The economy, booming. Couldn't ask for something better. They were very comfortable. They were wealthy. But the problem was, where was the wealth? And that's the challenge. some of the things that we see. Now, when we talk about these prophets, these prophecies, this is one that is a very national one. Some of them are very specific, personal, that you can look at. But this one is very national. And he starts right out, and he's going to go around the horn, as we would say, national, nations. But the people are responsible. If you'll recall Obadiah, one of the things he said was he would include Judah and Jerusalem, indicating the people of Judah and then Jerusalem, the leadership. So it's still the people are responsible, but this is a national. And there's a lot of wonderful things, not wonderful, I should say, but a lot of critical lessons that we can learn today on what we see going on in the news and what's happening. We can learn a lot. God has not gone to sleep, put it on cruise control. He's still active. He still believes in justice and righteousness, and he's going to carry forward. We can look at the prophets and see the way God spoke to the nations, how God has brought his judgment on nations, how he's tried to wake them up and bring them back. Knowing that even like with the 10 northern tribes, the northern kingdom, they were never really going to come to a full repentance maybe, but he still let them go so far. And even though you would say they were chosen, no, they were in a covenant relationship and God respected that. But so when we look around today and we see the headline news, so many people are getting caught up and worried and involved in what's happening in the Ukraine and Israel and all around the world. And you know what? When we go through this book, I hope that you'll look and understand that first and foremost, whatever's going on, God's in charge. Okay? He is. And it's not like he just, like I said, kicked it on cruise control and let what's happening in the Ukraine happen and let what's happening in the Middle East happen and just going, oh, well, we'll just see how those guys, what falls out. No. We don't understand the logic behind what God does, you know, what's going on and who's better than who over there. But I'll tell you what, we can look back and we can study the minor prophets, and you can see that God used some methodology that we would go, whoa, that's just absurd. Habakkuk, please recall Habakkuk. Habakkuk did not like the way God was going to use the Assyrians to punish the children of Israel. So when we look at this prophecy, let's keep that in mind, that one thing is that as he describes the conditions there's a lot of things that, because of the language and terminology that we're reading in the Old Testament, it's like, oh, well, that's not us. That's not us. That's not us. Oh, yeah, it is. And that's what I want to do. I want us to look at it and bring it to light. Whether it is exactly what's going on, I don't know. I'm not going to be the one to sit and go, oh, we're in the days of Amos, and oh, here we go. I'm not going to say that. But I'll tell you what. I'm going to be wise enough to know that these are things in which we see God has a pattern of, and that God has carried out things in the exact same way we're seeing things unveiled. So that's what. And so it is kind of ironic that during a time of optimism, they were so corrupt. And this is also another pattern. You see nations that the more advanced they get, the more civilized they get, the more morally bankrupt they get. They really do. They think they're advanced, they think they're really wise, but you know what? No. They actually go the other direction morally. And this is when God comes in and gives them kind of what I call a reset. But you know what? You think you're smart, but you're forgetting the foundations of what God has said. That's why when I pray, I don't pray that God turns it into a Christian nation. I would love that. But I look back in all the nations before, what I pray for is leaders that will hold fast and understand that if they want true prosperity, that it's going to be guided by God's moral values. Call them what you want, but God's moral values. And this is why I pray that, because of a book like Amos. Because when we go through here, we see how far they went away from it. Now, the other interesting thing is going to be 30 years before this occurs. Amos prophesies in Judah, in Israel, the 10 northern tribes, the northern kingdom, for 10 years. So this book, even though it's 9 chapters, doesn't cover everything that he did. Now, we have no idea everything he did, This really is a book. It's kind of a snapshot of the message that he would probably continue to teach, preach. We know that, some like Isaiah confronted the king directly. We know that Jeremiah stood outside the temple and would preach. We know that there's a pattern the way the prophets would engage and wasn't always the same. So how did Amos do it? Well, we'll know in chapter 7 because he does have a confrontation. But as far as the rest of it, we don't know what he did for 10 years. We don't even know what happened to him. Did he die? Did he go home? But it had to be a very uncomfortable message for a man who had been isolated as a sheep herder, a farmer of sycamore. We talked about that, 12 miles out south of Jerusalem, and the ruggedness of the terrain, not used to being in urban areas with people all over you. The most argument you might have on a day might be one or two people and a bunch of sheep disagreeing with you. But now you're going, and people that shared your culture, remember, he is not from Israel, the 10 northern tribes. He's from the south. He also tells the high priest in chapter 7, he's going to tell him that I'm not a priest, I'm not a prophet. I'm not even from the school of prophets. There were schools of prophets. And there was a bunch of prophets in the south that were active. Hosea, Micah, Isaiah. There are prophets that are active that we are very aware of. And yet, it's fascinating to me that he goes to the hillside in the remote area and gets a goat herder. To go stand before the religious and political elites and bring this message to them. A lot of times you want to match the speaker to the people, somebody who understands the customs and such, right? I mean, you want to send somebody into an area that would at least know how it is to be in that culture and such. No, it's like the opposite. God took this man. And it does also fit with God's pattern in the way that God will deliver a message, and you may think that the way it's being delivered is foolish, but it's still from God. And if your heart's not pure enough and sincere enough and humble enough to want to seek God, then you're going to be stopped by the presence of a messenger. And that happens a lot. Sometimes people will judge Bible teachers based on their scholarly backgrounds or lack of and feel, wow, that person can't be that smart. So it is fascinating to me that you had very capable prophets in the South that he could have picked, but he doesn't. And that time of reprieve that they receive, is going to be over. But it's going to still be another 30 years before it ends. And the fact that despite he gave them these warnings time and time again, and this is what we're going to go into once we go, because I want to look at those. Because again, we read it and it just sounds so religious and so Old Testament that we disconnect what God was doing to the nation, and how could that be going on with us? Have we seen these things happening before? And are we seeing some of those even today? So let's dive into the outline. Again, when we look at the nation, that is an important outlier there. And when we see the locations of where he is worshiping. But he starts out with the message. And that's what we see. He talks about, and again, like I said, you'll see this theme here, national. So a depraved nation. He goes through and he lists them: Syria and Philistia, which is Gaza in that area. Syria for torture. Philistia for the way that they would trade and sell slaves, the way they treated them. Phoenicia, violating treaties after treaty, the way that they dealt with other nations. Just flat tyranny, Edom. Ammon, the treatment of the unborn. Should I say it? The treatment of the unborn. Yeah. See, that's what I mean. We read these and we just skip over some of the things of the pertinence. Like, oh, wow, that's just a modern day problem we're struggling with today. You know what? It's always, every one of these we see this. What's interesting is that look at the types of things that God is bringing them judgment. What's fascinating is Moab in the way that they desecrated the king's graves. Even God, that for some reason hit a bone with God, but if you look at Judah and then look at Israel, it's not focusing on the moral depravity per se of the straighting of slaves. Look what he does. Look at the difference. It's turning away from God's law, the apostasy. And a lot of that has to do because it hangs on the covenant relationship. With privilege, there is responsibility. They are privileged. They are privileged because of the covenant that God established with Abraham, that he has promised this nation these blessings to come through them, and God is holding faithful to his side of the covenant. The next, so we have the message of a depraved nation, 1 through chapter 2, 16, and then a doomed nation that he's going to talk about. And this judgment, it's a deserved judgment, and he's going to explain why. And he declares this judgment that's coming upon them, and then he describes it as well, what's going to happen. The next message is a defiant nation, talking about in chapter 4, 1 through 13, this defiance that Israel is showing, and this earthly judgment and how bad they are standing up against God's righteous judgments as well, and indulging in this iniquity. They're not just participating. They're like enjoying it. They're multiplying their pleasures and all the things that they're doing. And then the defiantness in the fact that they refuse to change at all, and refuse to return. So what does he do? He put famine upon them. They didn't return. He's going to send drought upon them. They don't return. Pestilence upon them. They don't return. He's going to cause wars. He caused wars. They didn't return. This is defiance. Fire, and they didn't return. And so he sums it up in this message of saying, guess what? Judgment's coming. And that's really kind of the theme of the book, is this idea of, well, now it's too late. Prepare to meet your God now. Now, if we look at those, and again, we're going to look at them a little more close. We're going to look at them closer next week when we look at these. Again, every one of these type of things, God is using nature, in other words, to try to get people to humble themselves. And we see this, like when Katrina hit, when we seen Hurricane Ivan go across Florida, devastation, and you see this amazing humanity that pours out, and it causes people to realize when they see their homes just leveled and everything in their lives gone, it has that effect where, it goes like, you know what? I have my family. I still have my health. I have something. But I've been so stuck in worshiping the material world that when we have these natural disasters, what are we doing with it? Have we not had drought? Have we not had some hurricanes, tornadoes, things that are going across? They're defiant. What he's trying to point out to them is, look at what I've done, and all you've done is just rebel. Well, we'll just implement climate control. Well, we'll just sit there and we'll have to reduce and genetically come up with a better seed that will be drought resistant, and we'll do, it's like, instead of looking at the spiritual implication, they just double down. The next one in chapter 5 is a dead nation. He describes them, and he has a song of death, and then he has this summons to life that he's calling them back. And this is where he has a sorrow for the people that he will express in there. The next message is about a delusional nation. We see that a lot. We see nations that are very delusional about what they're going to accomplish, the arrogance, but the delusion of it. They giving a false hope. They think because they're secure right now, that somehow that's going to make it easier. Well, we must be doing something right because we have peace. We must be doing something right because we're prospering. We must be doing something right because we're so much smarter and advanced than other civilizations. Well, that's exactly what Israel was doing. They had a false hope. And it was all on a delusional religion. It was on a faith. It was not. He's repulsed by their religion. Now they're going through the act. They're very spiritual. They have an intense religious program. They sacrifice. They're doing everything according to what they want. And they think that that delusion is that, oh, well, since we're so spiritual and we're worshiping the golden calves and doing such a wonderful job, that look at this, we're getting prosperity, we have no enemies and all this. And they're just, this is that part of that delusion, and it comes through that and that false god. He says they're decadent. In other words, they're rich. They have, which builds self-confidence. It builds self-indulgence. And it's going to bring self-destruction, isn't it? And he has this vision then he talks about. He sees this vision of locusts, and he has a vision of fire, and then the plumb line. All three of those he has used, the prophets have used. And that's what's fascinating. We'll look, that's nothing new. He's used those in other prophets as well, but all talking about the way this nation will be destroyed. He has a confrontation in the middle of this in chapter 7, and they're disinterested. They just flat out reject him because he's not a legitimate prophet. He doesn't live there. He's not from there, and therefore he's not. So they reject him, and the way that they respond too. So the next part, chapter 8, he has a vision of a deserted nation, a nation that's been abandoned, and this picture of judgment that's going to come upon them, and describes them as a people that are being judged as well. And he promises again. So chapter 8 is all about the idea of this disinterested nation that's going to be going through judgment and describing judgment, very focused on judgment. Judgment is what brings back righteousness. It corrects. And notice that flow, because when we get to the next chapter, that's where it's going to kind of flow. But he's got to make the correction. And this is what he's describing he's going to do. And the importance of this judgment, why it has to happen. But then 9, this is where we're going to look at this idea of a hopeful message. All the prophets always have something to do with the Messiah. There's always that. God, even though he's disciplining, no matter how harsh he is, he always lets people know that there is this divine vision that he's sharing with them. And it's always around the idea of the Messiah. And even the scholars all agreed all the way through the time with Jesus when he was there. They understood that the tail end of almost all of these minor prophets and stuff had this picture of this Redeemer, this one that would come. They didn't understand him when he came, but this is the picture that he does, showing. But it's also the idea of the Creator being glorified in this new messianic reign, this time where the covenant is going to be honored. Remember, that's what it's about with God and these people. I mean, what's the difference with them? What makes them, if you really dig back, when I told you the message of all the nations, there were very specific, grievous things, humanity, kind of things that they've done, but they're doing them too. But what he hones in on his people is this terrible, egregious type of failure to maintain that covenant relationship, because God's going to be faithful. Whether they do individually or not, and that covenant will be honored. In this messianic period, he talks about those who have been troubled are going to receive this comfort, this picture he will draw. And it's going to change everything. It's going to flip around from those who have been suffering in being captive. And this is where we have the idea, the illusions of captivity being set free, and what the mission of the Messiah is. Now, and that's why, we think about when Jesus comes, a lot of these things that he was fulfilling were hard for them to pull out specifically. And it wasn't going to be until later that they could see what was going on and tie all of these minor prophet messages with those judgments. So we're going to stop there. Next week, we will jump into the actual chapters and going through them. I hope you'd go ahead and read chapter 1 and 2 at least, and kind of go over that and be familiar with it. Because I don't want to go through and break down every nation and everyone there. We'll talk about just some of the structure of the language and then move on. So if you're with us this evening and there's something we can do to help you in your relationship with Jesus Christ, our Savior, the only Savior we have, I hope that you will think about what you need to do in order to either restore it or to establish it. and establishing it the way that we read in the Bible, which was people that understood that they were with sin, and sin separates them from God, and the way that it was restored is by faith in Jesus Christ, accepting him as your Savior, but then being baptized and receiving forgiveness of sin. So if there's something we can do to help you in that relationship establishing, or helping you encouraging it, let us know while we stand and sing.
Hark, the gentle voice of Jesus falleth tenderly upon your ear. Sweet his cry of love and pity calleth. Turn and listen, stay and hear. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's breast. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, come and I will give you rest. Take his yoke, for he is meek and lowly. Bear his burden, to him turn. He who calleth is the Master holy. He will teach if you will learn. Ye that labor and are heavy laden, lean upon your dear Lord's breast. Ye